The sky hung low, swollen with clouds that churned like restless beasts, their bellies heavy with the promise of rain. Twilight crept over the remote mountain village, washing the jagged peaks in bruised shades of purple and gray. The wind moved in sharp, unpredictable gusts, rattling the wooden shutters of homes huddled together in the valley below. Out here, at the very edge of the settlement where the mountain met the forest, the ground was uneven, stubborn with rocks, and slick from the drizzle that had begun hours ago. Each step sank slightly into the damp soil, releasing the smell of earth, rich, metallic, and tinged with something older, something that seemed to breathe beneath the surface. Yara stood in the clearing, the wooden handle of the shovel slick in her hands. She wore no coat, only a faded wrap skirt and a long-sleeved blouse that clung to her from the damp. Strands of her black hair, streaked with early gray, clung to her forehead and temples. She was small in frame, the kind of woman people often overlooked in the market, but tonight, every movement she made drew the eyes of the three men standing around her. They watched with a mixture of amusement and cruelty, their shapes looming in the dim light, their laughter sharp as the cold mountain air. Deeper, one of them barked, the youngest of the group, though his face carried a hardness that came from years of taking what he wanted. "You're not digging a garden for flowers, old woman? This hole needs to fit you when we're done." The words hung in the air, but Yara didn't pause. The shovel bit into the rocky soil with a dull thunk, jolting her arms each time she struck stone. She leaned her weight forward, forcing the blade through clay and gravel, each scoop landing in a small, growing pile beside her. Her breath came slow, measured, her movements steady. The tallest of the three men, the one with the deep scar running from his jaw to the corner of his mouth, stepped closer. He carried a machete lazily in one hand, its blade catching what little light remained from the sinking sun. "Maybe she's digging too slow on purpose," he said, glancing at his brothers. "Think she's hoping we'll get bored and let her go?" His tone was mocking, but something in his eyes lingered on her face, perhaps expecting fear, perhaps looking for it. If Yara heard him, she gave no sign. She set her foot on the shovel's edge and drove it into the ground again. A small spray of wet earth spattered her skirt. The men's laughter swelled behind her, but she did not join it, did not even look up. Her gaze was fixed on the soil before her, as if the hole she was digging was a task she had chosen, not one forced upon her. The third man, shorter but broad in the shoulders, shifted his grip on the crude wooden club he carried. "Strange, isn't it?" he said. "Not a single tear. Not even a beg. You'd think she'd at least ask for her life. What do you think, Yara? Still planning to walk away from this?" His tone was half taunt, half curiosity, as though he couldn't decide whether her composure unnerved him or amused him. She didn't answer. Her silence was a weight heavier than their threats, a quiet that settled between shovel strikes, filling the space where fear should have lived. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and long, as if the mountains themselves were growling. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it the sharp, metallic scent that came before a downpour. Somewhere in the forest beyond, a bird gave a single, sharp cry, then fell silent. The men didn't notice. They were passing a flask between them now, taking swigs of something strong enough to burn their throats and loosen their tongues. Their laughter came easier, their steps grew less steady, and their words more cruel. One of them made a joke about how light the work would be for them once she was in the ground. No coffin, just dirt to cover her. Another suggested they might keep her shack for themselves after this was done, maybe even her tiny patch of garden. The pit was only knee-deep now, the edges crumbling slightly from the damp. Yara paused for a moment, her hands resting on the handle of the shovel. Her breath steamed faintly in the cool air. She tilted her head slightly, almost as if she were listening, to the rain, to the soil, to something beneath it. A flicker of something unreadable passed across her face, too quick for the men to name. "You hear that?" the youngest asked, glancing at her stillness. "Hear what?" the tall one replied. But Yara was already moving again, each strike of the shovel deliberate, almost rhythmic now. The soil was loosening easier than before, the rocks shifting with less resistance. Water pooled faintly at the bottom of the pit, reflecting the dim light like a shard of dark glass. The men didn't care, they just told her to keep going, their voices loud to cover the creeping quiet of the mountain night. The clouds overhead swelled darker still, swallowing the last trace of daylight. A fine mist began to fall, cool against her skin. The men pulled their jackets tighter, muttering about the coming rain. Yara's hands did not falter. She kept her eyes on the earth as if she were reading it like a page only she understood. When thunder rolled again, closer this time, it seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The damp smell of rain thickened, mingling with the scent of clay freshly turned. And though the men stood above her with their weapons and their threats, it was Yara's steady rhythm, the quiet certainty of her movements, that ruled the clearing. There was no fear in her eyes, only something patient, something waiting. Her home sat where the hills began to fold into the forest, a small stone dwelling built by hands that no longer walked the earth. The walls, fitted without mortar, had been set by her husband in the early days of their marriage, each rock chosen for its shape and heft, each gap filled with moss to keep the wind from creeping in. It was not large, one room for sleeping and living, a small lean-to kitchen off the side, but it was strong and it belonged to no one but Yara. From her front step, she could see the valley below spread wide like an open palm, and beyond that, the mountains rose in layers of blue and shadow. In summer, the grass reached high and soft around her home, swaying in the breezes that carried the scents of pine and wild thyme. In winter, snow softened the edges of the hills and muffled all sound except for the crunch of her boots and the creak of tree limbs under their burden. She was alone here but not lonely, at least not in a way that anyone else could name. Yara had lived on this slope for many years, longer than some of the village's younger folk had been alive. Since the day she buried her husband beneath the tallest cedar in the grove, she had kept mostly to herself. People said grief had turned her quiet, but the truth was that solitude came easier than the noise of neighbors who didn't know how to sit with silence. Her husband had been the bridge between her and the rest of the village, and with him gone, she let the bridge crumble. Still, her absence in the marketplace didn't mean she was forgotten. People came to her when they needed things no one else could provide. She could read the sky like a book, predicting storms days before they came. Her knack for finding hidden springs in the hills was unmatched. More than once, she'd saved a shepherd's flock in a dry season by uncovering a thin trickle of water where the ground seemed solid. She could track the shift of roots beneath the soil, smell the promise of rain before a cloud appeared. There were those who respected her for these skills, offering small gifts of honey or wool in return for her help. The older women in the village would greet her politely when they crossed paths on the forest road, their voices warm but cautious, as though they feared to speak too long in her presence. And then there were the others, the ones who let their voices drop to a whisper when she passed, who muttered words like witch or earth talker when they thought she was too far to hear. Children too were divided about her. Some ran to meet her, eager for the berries or pine cones she sometimes carried in her apron, while others hid behind their mothers, peeking out with wide, mistrustful eyes. It was not uncommon to hear the village boys daring each other to creep up to her home, claiming they'd seen her talking to the stones or that strange lights moved through her garden at night. Yara never bothered to defend herself from these stories. She knew how quickly fear turned into invention, and invention into something harder to wash away. Let them think what they wished, the earth still spoke to her whether they believed it or not. Her garden was her truest companion, a strip of tilled soil carved into the slope beside her house. She grew vegetables and herbs, not only for herself but for the few who sought her help in times of sickness. A row of calendula bloomed bright as fire in summer, and behind it stands of rosemary, sage and mountain mint perfumed the air. There were roots, too, burdock, ginger and valerian, that she dug and dried with careful hands. She knew which plants could soothe a cough and which could still a racing heart, and though she gave them freely when asked, she kept careful track of who received them. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, she would walk barefoot into the forest, feeling the texture of the ground change beneath her toes. She claimed she could tell where the deer had bedded down for the night or where water moved deep beneath the roots. On more than one occasion, she returned with a skin full of clear, cold water drawn from a spring no one else could find. It was this closeness to the land that fueled the whispers. A woman who lived alone was already suspect in the eyes of some. A woman who seemed to listen to the hills and receive answers was something more dangerous. There were rumors that her husband's death had been foretold to her in a dream, that she had spoken to the earth and the earth had told her to let him go. Others said she knew the names of the spirits in the stones and that they followed her home at night. But for Yara, life was simple. Tend the garden, mend what needed mending, listen to the shifts of the land and leave others to their own business. She had no desire for conflict, no need for company beyond the trees, the soil and the low murmur of wind against the hills. The world had taken enough from her already, she would not offer it more by stepping into its quarrels. Still, she noticed the way certain men in the village watched her when they thought she wasn't looking, the way they measured her worth in things they could take. She had heard enough to know that envy could grow roots deeper than any cedar, and that when those roots reached the surface they brought trouble with them. And trouble, she suspected, had already begun to stir. Kuro was the kind of man who never looked at a thing without measuring what it could be worth. The eldest of 3 brothers, he carried himself like the village already belonged to him, though no one had ever given him that right. His eyes were sharp, narrow, the sort that seemed always to be weighing and calculating. He had built a life not through the sweat of his own back but through knowing which debts to collect, which favors to demand and which fears to stir. His brothers, Yara and Tenno, were shadows to his flame, quicker with their fists than their thoughts, but loyal to Kuro's ambitions. Yara was broad and thick-necked, his hands like the heavy stones Yara's husband had once carried to build their home. Tenno was wiry and restless, always chewing on a twig or tapping his fingers against his leg as if something inside him could never be still. Together they were a force few in the village cared to cross, not because they were noble or wise, but because they knew how to twist the rules until they favored them. The brothers had always kept a passing interest in Yara's land, mostly because of its position, perched higher than any other homestead with a clear view down the valley. But lately their interest had deepened. A traveling trader had passed through weeks before, bringing with him tales of ore veins that ran like silver rivers beneath certain hills. A man could carve a fortune out of the ground if he knew where to dig, the trader had said over a fire, and his eyes had lingered on the slopes where Yara lived. That was all it took for Kuro's curiosity to turn into hunger. He began to ask quiet questions. Where exactly did Yara walk in the mornings? Had anyone seen her digging beyond her garden? Did she sell more than she grew? When no one had answers, he supplied his own, spinning them into truths in the minds of those eager for a story. She's been sitting on it all this time, Kuro told his brothers one night as they sat in the dim corner of the tavern. Oregon silver, maybe gold. Why else would she cling to that place? Why else would she hide from the rest of us? She's guarding something. Yara grunted, skeptical but intrigued. And you think she's just going to hand it over? No, Kuro said with a slow smile. She won't have to. The land will be ours when she's gone. The words hung in the air, thick and deliberate. Tenno leaned forward, lowering his voice. You mean, make her leave? Kuro didn't answer right away. He drummed his fingers on the table, letting the silence press in. Some people leave on their own, he said finally. Others need a push. From that night on, the brothers' attention on Yara grew sharper. They began to watch her from the edges of the forest, noting when she left her home and how long she was gone. They whispered to neighbors about her strange habits, the way she seemed to listen to the hills, the possibility that she was hoarding something valuable. And slowly, those whispers began to take root, sprouting suspicion in minds already half willing to believe ill of her. It was easier than they thought to turn greed into a shared cause. A few villagers, lured by the idea of treasure in their own valley, began to nod when Kuro spoke of wasted land and selfish people who hoard their blessings. Others stayed silent, but their silence was not defense, it was permission. One evening, Kuro and his brothers stood on a ridge, looking down at the faint wisp of smoke rising from Yara's chimney. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. Kuro's eyes narrowed. She doesn't know it yet, he said, but that land is already ours. Yara and Tenno said nothing, but the grin they shared was full of teeth. It was late afternoon when the brothers came to her door, the sun bleeding low behind the ridge. The sky was clear but heavy with that odd stillness that comes before a storm. Yara had been sorting herbs at her table, drying their leaves in small bundles when the first knock came, not the polite, tentative sound of a neighbor, but the flat, heavy rap of someone who meant to be obeyed. She opened the door to find Kuro in front, his brothers flanking him like the edges of a blade. They didn't bother with greetings. Kuro's eyes flicked past her into the dim interior of her home, lingering on the neat shelves, the tools by the wall, the wide stone hearth. We've come to talk about your land, Kuro said, his voice smooth, almost conversational. You're all alone up here. It's too much for one woman. We could make better use of it. You'd be doing the village a service. Yara didn't move from the doorway. The land is mine, she said simply. Yara took a step forward, his shadow stretching over her feet. Everything belongs to the village, he said, parroting the words elders often used when taking from those too weak to resist. You've had more than your share. It was my husband's, she replied, her tone steady. And before that his father's. The soil remembers who tends it. It doesn't belong to you. Tenno gave a short, ugly laugh. So you're just going to keep sitting on whatever's under there? Keep it for yourself while the rest of us work for scraps. Yara's eyes narrowed. There's nothing under here but earth, rain and roots. The rest is in your head. Kuro's smile didn't reach his eyes. I think you're lying, Yara. And liars don't deserve to keep what they've stolen. The air seemed to shift at those words, the calm before the storm drawing tighter. For a moment, Yara thought he might step back, let the tension dissolve. Instead, he pushed past her into the house, his boots tracking dust across the smooth-packed floor. His brothers followed, their presence filling the small room with a restless, ugly heat. Kuro turned, planting himself in the center of the space. "You can make this easy. Sign the land over to us and we'll let you pack your things. You can start over somewhere else." "I will not," Yara said. It was the lack of hesitation in her voice that set something off in him. Jaro's jaw tightened. Tenno shifted his weight, glancing to his eldest brother. Kuro stepped closer until there was only a breath of space between them. "You think you're untouchable," he said, his voice low. "But the hills won't protect you. No one will. Not when they find out what you've been hiding." Yara met his stare without flinching. "The only thing I've been hiding from is the greed in men's hearts." That was when the heat boiled over. Kuro's hand twitched toward the knife at his belt. Tenno muttered something under his breath, too low to catch. Jaro cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the stillness. "Enough," Kuro said, stepping back and jerking his chin toward the door. "She's not going to hand it over. We'll take it another way." Outside the air was cooler, but not enough to quench the flare of their anger. As they walked away down the narrow path, their voices carried back to her. "She's of no use alive," Kuro was saying. "If she's gone, the land's free. The village will back us when it's ours." "We'll do it tonight?" Jaro asked. "No," Kuro replied. "We'll make her dig. Let her put her own hands in the dirt before it swallows her." Yara closed the door slowly, her fingers resting on the wood for a moment. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes had changed, darker, sharper, as if some part of her had been waiting for this. The wind had picked up by the time they brought her to the clearing, the kind that seemed to carry whispers through the trees. The ground was still damp from an earlier rain, the soil dark and clinging. Kuro shoved a shovel into her hands, the metal cold and heavy. The pit's outline was already marked in the earth, a jagged rectangle, its edges uneven where a boot had dragged through the dirt. "Start digging," Kuro said, his voice flat, almost bored. "Make it deep." Yara stepped to the edge without a word. The first thrust of the shovel bit into the earth with a dull crunch, the sound sharp in the hush that had settled around them. The soil resisted, packed with roots and stones, but she moved with steady rhythm, lift, turn, throw, each motion precise. The damp earth released its scent into the night, mingling with the faint tang of metal from the shovel's edge. Jaro leaned against a tree, crossing his arms, while Tenno busied himself pulling a jug of palm wine from a sack. They took turns drinking, the liquid sloshing and catching the firelight from a small, crackling blaze they had made nearby. The glow painted their faces in flickers, shadows sliding over their smirks. Kuro stayed closer, pacing the perimeter of the pit, his eyes tracking the progress of each shovelful. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "Too tired to beg?" Yara didn't answer. The shovel struck a stone with a jarring clang, but she worked it loose and tossed it aside without breaking her rhythm. Her hands were steady, her breathing even, as if the act of digging required no more effort than kneading bread. Tenno laughed, tipping the jug back. "Maybe she's planning to climb down there and curl up in it herself." "Would save us the trouble," Jaro added. The brothers' voices blurred with the scrape of metal on soil, the dull thud of earth hitting the growing pile beside the hole. The fire popped, sending tiny embers drifting upward into the dark. Every so often, the wind would stir the flames, and the shadows of the men and the lone digging figure would stretch long and strange against the clearing's edge. An hour passed, maybe more. The pit deepened. The men grew looser, their jibes slower and slurred with drink. Kuro still watched her, but even he began to lean against a tree, his attention wandering toward the wine jug. They spoke of what they would do with the land, each imagining their own version of wealth, houses with carved doors, silver rings, fields of grain, all spun from the soil beneath her feet. "Bet she knows exactly where the vein runs," Tenno said, swaying a little as he stood. "That's why she's digging so neat. Like she's looking for it." Kuro chuckled but didn't correct him. The sound of the shovel filled the silence again. Lift, turn, throw. Lift, turn, throw. Her expression never shifted. No fear, no pleading, no anger. Just the same calm, unwavering focus, as though each clump of earth was part of a task she had chosen herself. The fire burned lower. The shadows drew closer. The men stopped noticing the way she would pause every few minutes to glance at the ground, or the way her foot pressed into the soil as though testing its give. They didn't notice the faint curl of her lips when they laughed too loudly, or how her gaze lingered on the wine jug as it passed between them. By the time the pit reached chest height, the brothers' voices had thinned to murmurs. Tenno sat with his back against a log, eyes half-lidded. Jaro had stretched out his legs, picking at the dirt under his nails. Kuro was still standing, but his head dipped now and then like a man trying to fight off sleep. Yara's hands never slowed. The shovel slid into the earth again, the sound sharp in the soft night air. She tossed the dirt aside and straightened, the faintest gleam in her eyes catching the firelight. The men didn't notice. They were already too far from caution. The shovel bit into the earth again, the sound muffled by damp soil. Yara's breath rose and slow, even clouds before her face, the rhythm steady and deliberate. The wind had shifted, brushing against her cheek like the faint stroke of a hand. She let it guide her movements, feeling the pull of its invisible current. Each thrust, each turn, each drop of earth onto the growing pile was no longer just digging. It was marking, tracing an old pattern she had carried in her bones since she was a girl. Her grandmother's voice came to her, low and sure, the way it had on nights when the oil lamp burned low and the walls seemed to lean in to listen. The earth listens, child. It knows the tread of the guilty and the innocent. It drinks the blood of beasts and men, but when the blood of the blameless is about to spill unjustly, it stirs. The memory was as sharp as the scent of wet soil. She could almost see the old woman's lined hands tracing a circle in the dirt between them, her fingernails caked with years of planting, harvesting, burying seeds, and sometimes secrets. You call it by your breath and your hands and your will, her grandmother had said. But never in haste. The earth hates hurry. It moves for patience. Yara's hands shifted on the wooden handle, her fingers tightening just enough to feel the grain of the wood. She matched her breath to the rhythm of the wind, in and out, a long exhale for every lift of the shovel. The men behind her were still drinking, still tossing their lazy insults, but their voices had thinned to a distant hum in her ears. The soil here was rich, dark, heavy with moisture. Each time she broke it apart, she pressed the sole of her foot into the earth, letting her weight settle into it, letting the ground know her presence. In her mind, she whispered, not words exactly but a feeling, the same way her grandmother had taught her to speak to the roots of stubborn yam plants. The wind shifted again, sharper this time, rustling the low grass at the edge of the clearing. The firelight trembled. She heard one of the brothers mutter about the chill, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. They didn't see her eyes lower to the pit, the way she studied its shape, wide enough, deep enough, the sides clean and smooth like a mouth ready to close. Her grandmother's story always ended the same. When the earth decides, it moves quickly. Faster than any man can run. The shovel bit down again, striking a stone. Yara worked it free slowly, placing it at the edge of the pit, its surface slick with rain. She could feel the earth's weight beneath her feet now, as if the ground had thickened somehow. A part of her wondered if they felt it too, but the clink of the wine jug and the lazy laughter told her they were still blind. She kept digging, patient, unhurried, the pattern complete now in her mind. The wind answered in soft sways, and somewhere deep below, she thought she felt a faint tremor, not enough to see, not enough to startle, but enough to tell her the earth was indeed listening. The next thrust of the shovel slid into the ground too easily, as though the earth had suddenly turned to wet bread beneath the blade. Yara felt the shift instantly, not the softness of rain-loosened soil but something deeper, more deliberate. The scent of damp clay rose sharply, heavy and metallic, curling into the cool night air. Kuro noticed the change but smirked. "Looks like you finally hit the easy part," he said, tilting the wine jug to his lips. The firelight caught the slick sheen on the disturbed earth, but he didn't seem to care. Jero chuckled, tossing a pebble into the pit. "Dig faster, widow. We're getting bored." Only Tenno paused. He had been leaning lazily against the log, but now his brow furrowed. He squinted toward the hole, sniffing as though the air itself had altered. "Smells strange," he muttered. "Like the inside of a riverbank." "Or the bottom of your cup," Kuro said sharply, making the others laugh again. Yara didn't look at them. Her eyes were fixed on the darkening pit, its sides starting to glisten under the fire's flicker. The soil here was breathing, slowly, imperceptibly, but breathing nonetheless. She could feel it in her feet, a subtle swelling and contracting like a lung drawing air. She drove the shovel in again, the metal slicing through with a wet sound, each motion careful and precise. A faint, sucking noise followed as she pulled it free, and Tenno's head tilted like a dog hearing something just out of range. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice lower now. "Just mud," Kuro snapped, though he didn't step closer. "Keep working, woman." But Yara didn't need telling. She leaned on the shovel, eyes never leaving the hole, her face unreadable. The air felt denser here, the smell of clay mixing with something older, almost sweet, the way earth smells when it's been shut away from light for too long. The fire popped, sending a spark into the dark. None of them noticed it die in midair, swallowed by the dampness clinging to the night. Yara's fingers tightened on the shovel handle. The ground was nearly ready. The pit was deep enough now that Yara had to toss each shovelful of earth upward, letting it slide over the rim in damp clumps. The shadows on the walls trembled with the firelight, making the hollow seem alive, its slick sides glistening like the inside of some great beast's mouth. Tenno, the youngest, leaned over the edge, grinning down at her. "You're slow for someone digging her own grave," he jeered. His boots scraped the softened soil as he edged closer, balancing on a patch of ground that was darker and wetter than the rest. Yara didn't respond. She simply planted the shovel into the earth and rested her hands on the handle, tilting her head up to look at him with a calm that made his grin falter for half a heartbeat. The ground gave no warning, no crack, no slide, just a sudden collapse beneath his feet. The soil dropped away like water spilling from a jug, and Tenno's legs disappeared with it. He yelped in surprise, flailing for balance, but gravity and the softening earth pulled him forward. He tumbled in awkwardly, his back hitting the opposite wall before he landed with a wet thud in the pit beside her. The sound that followed was not the splash of mud, it was a low, sucking noise as though the earth was swallowing air. Tenno scrambled to his knees, his boots sinking deeper with each panicked movement. "Get me out," he shouted, reaching upward, his fingers clawing at the rim that was now well above his head. Kuro cursed and moved toward the pit, but stopped short when the walls shifted, not collapsing but drawing inward, the damp soil pressing closer to Tenno's body like tightening hands. His feet were already buried past the ankles, the thick, wet ground holding him fast. "Pull me!" Tenno screamed again, his voice cracking. His eyes were wide, his face pale under the smear of dirt. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank, up to his shins now, the walls rippling subtly as though alive. Yara stepped back, watching without expression. The shovel rested against her shoulder. She didn't need to move. The earth was doing exactly what she had asked. Kuro's shout split the night as he lunged toward the edge, grabbing for his younger brother's outstretched arm. The damp soil under his boots shifted, slick and unstable, forcing him to plant his feet wider. Yara was right behind him, half dragged forward by his own urgency. The firelight threw long, jagged shadows over their bodies, the kind that made the whole scene feel unreal, like a nightmare spilling into the waking world. "Hold on." Kuro barked, leaning dangerously far over the lip. His fingers brushed Tenno's, but the younger brother slipped lower, the pit pulling him down inch by inch. His boots made that awful sucking sound as they vanished deeper, like the earth had decided it was done letting go. Yara crouched low to grab Kuro's belt for support, stretching his other arm toward Tenno. "I've got him," he said, gritting his teeth. But the moment his weight shifted forward, the patch beneath him began to sag, water seeping up through the cracks in the soil like the earth was sweating. Yara said nothing. Her eyes moved slowly from one man to the other, then to the pit's floor. Her breathing matched the faint rhythmic tremor in the ground, a heartbeat they could not hear but she could feel. Suddenly the rim broke. It didn't crumble the way dry dirt might, it folded inward like a wet rug being pulled, and both Kuro and Yara pitched forward with startled grunts. They hit the side of the pit hard, sliding down in a messy tangle of limbs and curses until they landed in the same sucking clay that held Tenno. "Get up! Get up!" Kuro barked, but when he tried to stand, his legs sank almost instantly to the calf. He shoved at Yara, trying to free space, but the earth pressed back, heavy and unyielding. The damp smell of clay was overwhelming now, filling their noses and mouths with the taste of stone and old rain. Yara flailed, trying to dig himself out with his hands, but each scoop of dirt seemed to vanish before he could toss it aside. It simply slid back into place, tighter than before. "It's pulling me down," he gasped, voice climbing toward panic. Tenno's screams had become desperate, wordless noises. His legs were swallowed to the knees, and when he tried to yank one free, the other sank deeper. The ground didn't act like mud, it was deliberate, holding them as if it had fingers. Above them the fire cracked, throwing sparks into the damp air. Yara's shadow stretched long against the wall of the pit, her figure still and tall, the shovel a dark slash across her back. She didn't look down in pity, nor did she gloat. Her eyes were steady, ancient in their stillness, fixed on the slow collapse beneath her. Kuro twisted his head toward her. "Help us. Pull us out." His tone was not pleading, it was demanding, sharp with the authority he always assumed would be obeyed. But there was a thread of fear woven through it now, thin but unmistakable. Yara didn't move. The night wind rose slightly, brushing the loose strands of her hair across her face. The damp scent thickened, curling around them all. The pit deepened on its own. The walls slid downward and inward with a strange, fluid grace, no longer behaving like soil but like something that had been waiting for this moment. The brothers tried to brace themselves against the shifting sides, but their hands only sank into the slick clay, offering no grip. Jaro's breathing was ragged now, chest heaving. "Kuro? I can't feel the bottom anymore," he said, voice breaking. His legs were trapped so tightly he could barely shift his weight. Kuro cursed and strained upward, reaching toward the rim. But it was too far, and with each attempt the ground seemed to grab tighter, pulling them all down together. Even Tenno had stopped shouting now, his head jerking from side to side as though trying to understand the impossible, how the very earth was claiming him. The night grew quieter, except for the sucking pull beneath them and the slow, deep breaths of the wind through the trees. The rain that had threatened earlier began to fall in thin, cold drops, pattering on the fire, hissing as they hit the hot wood. Yara shifted her grip on the shovel, but she didn't dig. She simply leaned it against her shoulder and stepped closer to the rim, looking down into the pit where the three brothers writhed, trapped waist-deep now. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough to almost be mistaken for part of the rain. "The earth remembers." The brothers froze, not because the words made sense to them, but because the tone in which she spoke made it clear they were no longer dealing with the widow they thought they could bury. And below them the pit kept closing. The rain had settled into a steady mist, softening the edges of the firelight. Yara stood at the rim of the pit, her bare feet planted firmly in the damp soil, the shovel balanced in her hands. The three brothers were no longer shouting threats. They were pleading, their voices cracking in a way that didn't belong to men who had always believed themselves untouchable. "Yara, oh, we were wrong," Kuro rasped, his voice hoarse from the strain of shouting. "We'll give you anything, land, gold, anything you want. Just get us out." Jaro added his own promises in a rush, stumbling over the words. "We'll leave, never come back. You'll never hear from us again." His eyes darted up at her, searching for the smallest flicker of mercy. Even Tenno, the youngest, was weeping now, his cheeks streaked with mud and fear. "Please," he whispered, barely audible. "Please." But Yara's face was still, her eyes reflecting no anger, no satisfaction. Only that deep, quiet calm that unnerved them more than rage ever could. Without a word, she drove the shovel into the wet earth. The blade slid in clean, the ground offering no resistance. She lifted the first scoop of soil, dark and heavy with rain, and tipped it into the pit. It landed with a dull, wet slap against Kuro's shoulder, sliding down to cling to his chest. "Stop. Wait. We can talk about this." Jaro barked, but his voice broke mid-sentence as she sank the shovel into the earth again. Another scoop followed, and another, each movement deliberate and measured. The rhythm was unhurried, almost ceremonial, lift, turn, drop. The ground seemed to move with her. For every shovelful she threw, more soil slid inward on its own, thick clumps tumbling down the pit walls to pile around their trapped legs. The earth was closing faster than her arms alone could manage, as though some unseen will had joined her in the work. Kuro twisted his shoulders, trying to push himself upward, but the clay sucked him lower with a groan like wet leather pulling apart. The mud lapped at his hips now, heavy and cold. "Yara, listen to me," he tried again, voice rising. "We didn't mean to." Another scoop hit him square in the chest, cutting him off mid-lie. His mouth snapped shut as a clod rolled up toward his chin. Jaro and Tenno were sinking faster. The mud was already at Tenno's ribs, pressing against him like a living thing. He gasped and tried to claw at the pit walls, but his hands slid away slick and useless. Jaro's protest had dissolved into panicked, wordless grunts. The sound of the shovel cutting through wet soil filled the air, steady and relentless. Yara's breathing was even, her gaze never wavering from the work. Above them, the mist thickened, wrapping the scene in a gray veil. The rain hissed softly against the fire, which had burned low, its orange light flickering over the pit like a fading heartbeat. Their voices grew muffled as the earth climbed higher. Kuro's head tilted back in desperation, trying to keep his mouth above the rising wall. "Help us. Someone." His words choked off as a fresh slide of mud splashed across his face. He coughed, spitting soil, but the space to breathe was shrinking. Jaro's eyes rolled toward her one last time, pleading without sound. His lips moved, but whatever words he had left were swallowed by the damp, heavy air. Tenno had stopped struggling entirely, his head bowed, his hair plastered to his face. Yara's hands did not slow. Scoop after scoop, she filled the pit, and the earth answered her, collapsing in thick folds until only the tops of their heads were visible. One final shovelful tipped over, sliding down to cover them completely. The sound of their muffled cries was gone now, replaced by the soft settling sigh of soil finding its place. Yara stepped back from the edge, the shovel blade resting in the ground beside her. The rain kept falling, pattering against the fresh mound, sealing it smooth. The earth was quiet again. The last shovelful slid into place, dark and heavy, merging with the mound that had swallowed the brothers whole. Yara let the shovel fall to the ground with a dull thud. The silence that followed was complete. No more ragged breathing from the pit, no pleading, no sound at all except the whisper of the mist thickening into rain. It began as a slow patter, cool drops spotting the fresh earth, darkening it in irregular patches. Then the clouds above broke fully, releasing a steady curtain of water that soaked her hair and ran cold rivulets down her neck. The scent of wet clay rose in waves, rich and metallic, as if the earth itself was drawing in a deep, satisfied breath. Yara stepped forward and crouched by the mound. She pressed her palms into the soil, fingers spread wide, feeling the warmth still lingering beneath the surface where the brothers had struggled moments before. The rain made the dirt pliant, and she began smoothing it carefully, dragging her hands over the uneven places until the ground lay flat and seamless with its surroundings. The act was slow and deliberate, each stroke blending the fresh burial into the hillside. No marker was left, no sign to tell where 3 lives had ended. Only the faint swelling of the earth betrayed what lay beneath, and even that would vanish as the ground settled under the weight of the storm. Her expression gave nothing away. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of grief. Her face was as still as the mountain itself, her thoughts hidden somewhere far deeper than the soil she had just sealed. The rain clung to her lashes, ran down her cheeks, but her breathing was steady, and her gaze never wandered from the mound until the work was finished. Water pooled in shallow depressions around the burial, the drops hitting with soft, rhythmic plinks. Each impact pressed the soil tighter, packing it down like a closing fist. The edges of the mound blurred into the surrounding ground, until even Yara could barely tell where her work began and ended. Above, the clouds hung low and heavy, their bellies scraping the tops of the dark hills. The forest beyond was a wall of dripping green, its branches sagging under the weight of the rain. Somewhere within, a night bird called once and then fell silent, as though unwilling to disturb the quiet that had settled over the land. Yara rose slowly, brushing the mud from her palms onto her skirt. Her movements were unhurried, each gesture deliberate, like someone completing the last steps of a long ritual. The shovel still leaned where she had left it, its blade sunk shallow into the ground, rainwater running down its wooden handle. She didn't reach for it. The tool had done its work, the rest belonged to the earth. The pit was gone now. In its place was only a patch of wet ground under the open sky, rain falling in steady sheets, carrying away any trace of the violence that had taken place there. If someone passed by in the morning they might notice the soil was softer here, darker than the surrounding earth, but they would not know why. The hillside held its secret, and Yara, with her unreadable eyes and rain-slick hair, turned toward the narrow path that led back to her home. Behind her, the mound drank in the rain, swelling once more before it began to settle for good. The sound of the storm covered everything, wrapping the night in a cloak of water and silence. Under the hills, the quiet was absolute. They never farmed that patch again. Seasons passed, and though grass would grow there, it was always a shade too pale, its roots too shallow. The soil remained strangely soft, even in the height of the dry season, and when a spade or hoe struck it, the metal would bend or snap as though the ground resisted intrusion. Children were warned not to play there, and animals, dogs, goats, even the stray cattle that wandered the hills, would skirt the place entirely, their steps quickening as they passed. The old people said the earth remembered. They spoke of the night the brothers vanished and the storm that followed, though no one outside the village knew the truth. Some claimed they had run away after angering the wrong spirit, others whispered that the mountain had swallowed them whole. But when asked directly, Yara would only tilt her head, as if weighing the worth of the question, and say nothing. She lived out her years in the same small home by the forest's edge, her gardens flourishing even in poor seasons. Those who needed water in times of drought came to her, and she would point them toward hidden springs. Those who fell ill sometimes sought her herbs, though they left quickly, unwilling to linger under her steady gaze. The whispers about her never stopped, but they carried a new edge now, part fear, part respect. From time to time, travelers passing through would hear the story, spoken low around evening fires. It had changed in the telling as such tales do. In some versions the earth itself had risen to defend Yara. In others, she had made a bargain with an ancient spirit who still dwelled beneath that cursed ground. But always the story ended with the same warning: Never force the earth to take a life unjustly, for it may take yours instead. Long after Yara was gone, the people still avoided the patch on the hillside. Even strangers, unaware of its history, would feel something there. A stillness in the air, a pressure beneath their feet, the prickling sense of being watched. And on nights when the rain fell hard and the wind swept through the mountains, some swore they could hear muffled voices in the ground, as though the soil itself remembered the weight of the living and the way it had closed over them, sealing the truth forever.